I don't know. I don't know how it's going to be. Okay, good afternoon. I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. That for those who don't know and doubt of his qualifications, the best qualification he has is that he is my husband. So I've known Jon for the entire 17 years that he has been working on this topic of management plan non-implementation. Since the time when he was working for Rare Center for Tropical Conservation in Honduras, through his master's degree at the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, to his consulting with UNESCO World Heritage Center, and more recently as founder of the PUP Global Heritage Consortium. I was with him also when he started writing this book 10 years ago. And when he traveled all over the world, well, I saw him travel all over the world, collecting lessons learned that contributed to what he will share with you today.
Just getting the camera.
Okay? Okay.
Yep, just getting the camera.
If you have ever wondered why plans, especially environmental and cultural management plans, so often end up in office shelves, unimplemented, and thought it was just lack of resources to implement, then think again. As far back as his undergraduate days at Dartmouth College, under his mentor Donella Meadows, he has always looked to systems thinking and later holism for his explanations. So if you like answers that are both deep and also practical, you will be happily surprised, hopefully we will be happily surprised with what you learn in the next half an hour. So please help me welcome Jon.
Imagine you're walking into the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, nearly 600 years ago. What's the first thing that you'll notice? You'll probably smell the fire in the fireplace to keep the workshop warm. Then you'll smell a lamp tarnish, a black lamp tarnish used for printing the Gutenberg Bibles. You'll also hear a pounding of a hammer of craftsmen who's molding or the cast used to create new letters in the movable type. In the middle of the workshop, you'll notice the famous Gutenberg printing press. There's two gentlemen there. One of them is the typesetter. The other is the pressman. And the pressman is pulling a big lever. And a plate is coming down. And on this plate here is paper, handmade, watermarked, and imported from Italy, pressing against the type form, which has the letters and the ink, thus printing a page of the Bible. Now that page then goes over here to where there's some other people called illuminators. And the illuminators are responsible for coloring in all the decorations and the big fancy letters. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of one of the Gutenberg Bibles. It's called rubrics. So they're painting them in. And these guys on this particular day happen to be working on the first book of the Bible. You all know which the first book of the Bible? Okay, good. There you go. Then that page comes over here to the bindery. And the binders, you're one of the binders. The binders are over here, and they're using a pigskin sewing cord to tie it all together into a hardcover book. Now, again, you've probably seen the Gutenberg Bible. This is not a book that is easily updated. Matter of fact, it's impossible to update this book. But to Gutenberg, that's okay. I mean, he reasoned, God's probably not going to change his mind anyway. Let's do this. Let's make a hardcover book with sequential pages, beautiful investment in decorations, impossible to update. And you know what? Nearly 6 centuries later, we're still doing the exact same paradigm for our books and for our plans. You've got your perfect binding. The pages are sequential, 1, 2, 3, 4. An investment in graphic design. I mean, this isn't something you can just, we got an error here on chapter 3. Pull it out and put a new page in. No. But the problem is, back in the time of Gutenberg, the Bible was okay that it never got updated. As a matter of fact, that first book of Genesis is probably the single plan in the history of humanity to ever be implemented to the letter. Let there be light. But today, we don't enjoy the same kind of certainty that Gutenberg and God had back then, right? Our world is changing very rapidly, and having plans in that format means a major barrier to implementation. They can't be updated. So that's an outdated idea that we're using still for the format of our plans. And in fact, there's a variety of outdated ideas that are contributing to what I would say is a global crisis, maybe a silent global crisis in plan non-implementation. It's actually affecting all kinds of plans in every field, whether it's education or corporations, universities. We've seen this. But my particular battlefield is heritage, environmental plans, cultural heritage plans. And especially in our field, in this subfield of all plans, almost nobody has studied this problem. I mean, it's just like, that's why I say silence, kind of like gone over their heads. So if we look over, well, who has studied? There's one fairly well-known study by Leverington and colleagues, published in 2010, where they studied natural sites all over the world and found that only 30% of natural sites in the world are adequately managed. And one of the main reasons they're not, the other 70%, is because of lack of implementation for plans. A different kind of evidence comes from Art Peterson, who is the founding director of the Sustainable Tourism Program of the World Heritage Center of UNESCO, who had obviously a very global view of tourism plans. And he said, or observed, that most sites don't even have tourism plans, and those that do, almost none of them actually implement. But the piece of evidence that I find, and again, it's a different kind of evidence, but the piece that I find actually most moving is that in the 17 years that I've been working on this problem, and I've talked to a lot of park managers and a lot of park planners, not one has ever denied the possibility that this global crisis of non-implementation exists. Why? Because everybody's been involved in a plan that ends up on the shelf, and if not, at least they've seen plans that have ended up on shelves. Probably for more like student folk, like some of you. Maybe you haven't been involved in one of these planning situations yet. You will be, and I'm sure you'll have the same experience. And in fact, this problem affects all of us. You don't have to be a planner, you don't have to be a park person, you can be turf management, because what happens every morning, we wake up and we write up a list either mentally or on paper. I bet you don't do it on paper, but I do, right? You have this list of things we're going to do, and by the end of the day, darn, most of the things on my list have not been crossed off yet. And funny, I did not plan this in advance, just happened to be going to the New York Times this morning. The art of making and not making plans. And it says here, I'm just going to read one little part. The New York Times covered the culture of plan canceling as early as 1986. Those who cancel do so for a variety of reasons that range from failing to write down lunch dates to psychological problems. So, non-implementation is a problem that affects us all every day of our lives, professionally or not professionally. So you can imagine figuring out the roots of this problem is extremely important, not just for all of us, not just for heritage, but for the whole world, right? And it's not just, as Marisol alluded in the introduction, it's not as simple as just a lack of resources. It has to do more with a lack of new ideas. So what I want to show you today is why we still plan with outdated ideas. And why we have to understand these ideas and have a new vision for why our plans, how our plans interact in the real world. We have our plans on paper, and then they have to interact with the real world, and that's where the problems really begin. And this answer to why plans don't get implemented is one that took me 15 years to come up with an answer that was actually useful. So I want to share this journey with you. Not the whole 15 years, but an abbreviated version in the next few minutes. It all started in 1998 when I was working for a nonprofit conservation organization called Rare Center for Tropical Conservation, based in Honduras. And we were working with a park called Pico Bonito National Park, which is right on the coast, of the northern coast of Honduras, the Caribbean coast, One day I walk into the office. It's a wooden office, and you can almost feel the air conditioning leaking out through the little holes in the boards. And the president, Vito Steiner, walks up to me and says, "John, we just got $5,000 to make a public use plan from this foundation. Can you offer us a suggestion on a methodology or a consultant? Because we don't know how to do that." And I said, "Well, I don't really have direct experience, but we're partners. Well, we could try to look something up for you." So I went and talked with colleagues. I looked in the literature. I checked the internet, or at least what existed of the internet back in 1998. And instead of finding a methodology or a consultant that I could recommend to my friend Fito, what I found was a landscape in Latin America full of management plans of all kinds. Conservation plans, financial plans, protection plans, and they were lying dead and dying, partially and fully unimplemented across this landscape. So I came back to Fito and said, "Fito, unfortunately we couldn't find anything to recommend to you. But even though it's a small amount of money," it was $5,000 back then, "and we're a grassroots ecotourism development organization, we think we can come up with something at least as good as what's out there to help you." And I said, "Oh, really? Okay." But I had to go back to my boss, Brett Jenks, who is now the CEO of RARE, and I broached the idea to him, and he said, "Fine, but ourselves find out why plans don't get implemented." So I had my mandate in 1998. And I go back to Fito and say, "Okay, we'll do this, but there's two conditions, one for us and one for you. The condition for you is that you guys have to write the plan yourself, not us." See, even back then, we had this inkling that somehow the way consultants are used has something to do with the plan implementability. And the other condition was for us, and that was simply to figure out why plans don't get implemented. And we also had another inkling that it wasn't simply a lack of resources. It was too easy to blame a lack of resources. So that started my 15-year journey. And it was kind of an exciting moment. I mean, that's a big question, right? I mean, why in the world, and I mean that literally, why in the world do plans so often end up on the shelves? But I haven't done the math, but I was probably like 28 back then. And who was I to take on that question? I mean, I wasn't a planner. I had only been out of graduate school like 1 year. I mean, that was very intimidating and exciting at the same time, if those two emotions can coexist. I think they can. As I remember it, they did. But I knew that answer would be very valuable if we ever come to know it, right? Valuable for students, valuable for planners, valuable for the world. So over the next 3 years at RARE, we worked on a project with UNESCO, working in World Heritage Sites. Based on our experience with Pico Bonito, I was managing a program called Public Use Planning, like visitation managing in protected areas. And we worked in Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and Indonesia. And I began to notice something interesting about plans, because all these sites already had plans, that there seemed to be this interesting similarity between plans and scientific studies. I mean, if you think about it, most scientific studies and plans, first you need to have special funding. It's not part of your regular budget. You have to look for a donor or something like that. And then you have this phase of collecting data, whether it's about whatever your research topic is, or like field research, site assessment. Then you analyze these data and you come to some conclusions or management prescriptions in the case of a heritage plan. Then you write up your document, then you submit it to peer review in both cases, you finalize the document, you publish it in both cases, and then you hope somebody implements. And it's like, wow, really the plans that we're doing all around the world are kind of emulating how we do scientific studies. And they're really technical, the plans that we're doing. I wonder if that has anything to do with the problem. I got to thinking more like a few years later, and realized that for these scientific, technical plans to function, to be effective, they required a certain kind of world to work in. They required certain assumptions about the world in order for them to have any chance of actually making a difference. And this world, I would come to call with someone else who I'm about to talk about, the plus world. plus in each of the 4 letters indicates one of the meanings of plus. Yes, you already know it. Don't tell anybody. And the same for you. So in the plus world, you have the letter P, and P stands for, okay, now you can do it. Remember? No! We were playing Ultimate when I told them you're not expected to remember. What's the P stand for? Predictable, right? In order to make these management plans that last 5, 10, 15 years, we have to some degree, be able to predict the future, right? Because we write it in 2016, and then we rewrite it again in 5 or 10 years. So we have to have some ability to predict the future. Then we have the L. That's the toughest one. Okay. Well, you tell me when I get to the letter you do know. Okay. So L is for linear, right? Linear is a way to simplify things. Where basically we have 1 unit increase in poaching, then you have 1 unit increase in anti-poaching to match the problem. Or, A, B, C, D in a linear. But anyway, linear thinking, it makes it much easier to deal with problems, especially complex problems. The U, okay, no.
Hold up, yes.
Anybody want to take a shot at the U? Because I probably told you too at one point. Oh, nice. Did you read my notes?
Okay, I'm not going for the
It just makes sense. Understandable. Exactly. Again, if we have a plan that's supposed to last 5 or 10 years, and we're coming up with the solution, the management solution, we've got 1 shot to get it right. Because we're not touching this plan again in another 5 or 10 years, essentially. So we have to assume that we can basically understand the dimensions of a problem in order to come up with management prescriptions to try and deal with it. So we have to assume the world is understandable. With enough information and enough smart minds, we can understand the problems and put those into our scientific plans. And then the S. What?
Is it stable?
It is. Nice, nice. Thanks for remembering. 25% is not a passing grade, but it's better than 0. So S, stable, right? Once again, the conditions that we are living in today more or less are the conditions that are going to exist in 5 or 10 years, because that's the horizon, the planning horizon of many of our management plans. So we have to assume that relative stability will entail or will ensue, will follow this planning process. So if you think about it, plus is also another word for which mathematical operation? Addition, which is the simplest of mathematical operations. So once again, that sort of symbolizes the simplicity that we need this world to be in order for these scientific studies, which don't get updated and are in a format that can't be updated, to actually yield an effect in the world. You might say that this plus world is sort of like a controlled laboratory. Now, not everybody has a laboratory like I'm described, but you can imagine kind of a stereotypical laboratory where you walk in and the humidity and the temperature are all controlled. You hear the humming of the air conditioning. You have your standardized fluorescent lights, white walls. And in this particular laboratory over here, you have a door. It's a shiny metallic door that goes to the outside. And when it opens with a Star Trek-like swoosh. Would you guys like to come with me outside to see what the real world looks like? Anyone want to come? You don't actually have to get up. Okay, so we will, but before we go through that door, let's just take a look back at the plus plans in this laboratory. Now, these plans here, they're well adapted for the conditions in this laboratory, right? It's sort of like a delicate tropical flower in a greenhouse in Canada. I bet there's a turf equivalent, right? You know, some kind of tropical grass that can't live in Canada and only lives in your greenhouses. Is there such thing like? Okay. But and if you went outside in the winter here in Kansas, or it didn't have to be Canada, that turf, that sod wouldn't do too well, right? I don't study this. Somebody in trouble? Okay. Okay. So anyway, that's this. Those are the plans. These are the plans that are well adapted for these conditions that are understandable, stable, predictable, linear, relatively controlled. So anyway, now let's go out this door and see what the world's like. Now out here, we've got a very different kind of world that we live in, right? Out here is a world where things are changing rapidly, where all we have to do is look in the newspaper any day, and this happens to be today's paper, and find things that don't follow the plus formula. Let's see. Florida and Texas might go to a Democrat. Now that's not something that could have been predicted even a month ago. And what's this? The Cubs are in the World Series? Jeez! And to be true to my environmental form, September is the hottest September in history. And this year will probably be the hottest year in recorded history. So there's a lot of change going on, a lot of surprises in this world. So we give it a different name. And this name is the dice world. Why do we call it dice? Because when you roll a die, assuming it's not loaded, of course, you can never really be sure what number is going to come up. And of course, the letters mean something. So, D, just anytime, D is dynamic. Right? The behavior of systems in this world is nonlinear, discontinuous, generates lots of surprises. Kind of the opposite of linear in plus. I, impossible to completely understand. Right? The universe has an element of mystery to it. And as Heisenberg said, all you have to do is look at what you're observing and you'll change it. And of course, even when we think we understand something after studying it for a while, it does change. So that's kind of the opposite of understandable. The C. See, you want to try that? No. But you're close. Pardon the cracking voice. It's complexity. It's complex, right? Complex meaning there's many variables with all kinds of interactions generating emergent properties. Somebody here want to tell me what an emergent property is? We get a lot of scientists in this room. No volunteers. Well, if I were to cut Tyler open, do you mind? Now you're done eating, right?
Yeah.
If I cut him open and extract his organs and put them on the table, metaphorically is enough, you can all picture this part, right? And I start studying these organs, is there a way by studying these different organs I can come away with understanding who Tyler is as a person, or even how a human operates by looking at the parts? Anyone? Okay, I got a no in the back. I'll stick with that answer. No, you can't. The emergent property is not just you as an individual, but you as a species, you as a concept, as a multicellular organism. So that's part of complexity, is interrelationship between all these organs and many other things generates properties that none of those pieces have. And then the last one, E, you can chime in now, you were really close on the last one. Ever-changing.
Okay, there we go.
Ever-changing. That's for the short term. Things are always changing, always getting new surprises. In the long term, E stands for evolving. That the whole universe, since the Big Bang, is evolving, moving towards greater interconnectivity, complexity, self-organization, consciousness. So this is the world that Einstein has given us, or at least described for us, the chaos theory. This is superstrings and super surprises. This is the world that we see every day, with change accelerating much faster now than it did yesterday, much faster now than it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But of course, we don't live in a laboratory, right? We live in this dice world where our plans are working. I got a piece of this experience of the dice world when I was working at RARE between 2001 and 2003. Two of the sites that we were working with were Indonesian World Heritage sites. You may have heard of Komodo National Park, the big dragons, and Ujung Kulon National Park, which was on Java, and that has the Javanese rhinos. And we were applying this public use planning methodology that we had worked with Pico Bonito, much more participatory, much more training oriented, and the local counterparts in Indonesia, they were getting very excited. They were working together with the community, and then both of their public use plans were approved by the government, and they were gung-ho to start implementing. But then the project ended. Money ran out, UNESCO was gone, and RARE's response to them was, sorry, we're no longer going to help you. We don't have resources. As a matter of fact, we're not even interested in tourism anymore. We're going to go do something else. So I felt like I was just forced to turn my back on my colleagues and friends 12 time zones away. They kind of left them out to dry, hanging out there. All this building up expectation and then not being able to fulfill. And that was a moment when I had learned one of my first early lessons learned about implementation. One of that lesson learned is you cannot assume that implementation will just come naturally after the plan, where we generally assume the plan is the hard part and the implementation is the relatively easy part, which is why we don't invest in implementation, which is why donors just give money to making the plan and not to implementation, which is why RARE stopped after the plan was approved. But it wasn't just the implementation that came to an end prematurely, but also my job. Because I was part of the end of the ecotourism, the end of that project. And for the first time in my life, I too felt left out to dry, out into the wind. I had no job, no paycheck, no security. And I have this new big idea that I wanted to tackle. And now I didn't even have an organization to support me. I felt alone and without a paycheck. This was even before it. Oh no, I had already knew you. That's right. That's right. Before we were married, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, you felt it too. So I had to go off into the world, and I would eventually come years later to realize, and I'm sure you won't correct me, I hope, but basically I was forced to sacrifice an establishment job, with an organization, a paycheck, benefits. And at the time I thought that was terrible. Then I came to realize that the only way I could work in this field on this topic would be to continue to make that sacrifice, because I could not work in an establishment organization. And ultimately it was a sacrifice that I've been making, continue to make to this day, on behalf of my family as well. I hope maybe one day I can work in the establishment, but in order for that to happen, it would require bringing the establishment towards the dice world. And what do I mean by the establishment? In this case, I especially refer to the three big global heritage organizations in the world, which are, UNESCO's one, and then the other two. The one in charge of natural heritage that advises UNESCO, IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the one that advises on built cultural heritage, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments. These are the three big ones. They pretty much guide the world in terms of policy in how planning is done in heritage areas. So, given that I was alone, I had no paycheck, nobody was next to me trying to deal with this big question, I could have just jettisoned the question, but I decided to continue with it. But I was in no mood to dream at that time about my future. So now I'd like to take a moment. I really thought I had turned off the internet on my phone. I apologize. I was going to, but I forgot to. That was the chairman of the board of my organization. We'll get to him in a moment. It's because there's no external button to turn it off on this computer. Anyway. Yeah, it's high tech. Anyway, he usually calls twice. So anyway, I'd like you all now to take a moment and think about barriers that you've encountered in your own personal lives, either in your planning process in which you've been involved or that you've witnessed. Just barriers that you think might contribute to non-implementation. I'll just give you a couple seconds to think about that. So this poll, I was able to make in 2006 with a study financed by the Nature Conservancy and executed by Cartier University, which is a postgraduate natural resource management university based in Costa Rica, to managers and planners associated with 5 national parks in Costa Rica. So we asked them, well, what are the barriers that you've encountered in trying to implement your management plans? So as you might imagine, we got back a really long list of those over 130 different items, responses from the interviewees. And a lot of these were overlapping, and a lot of these said the same thing and in different words. But it was not a manageable number. So we grouped them into what ended up being 14 categories. And maybe these categories you might recognize given your own. So there was management. Everyone said, oh, management has all kinds of problems. The document itself has problems. The lack of personnel, not enough training, not enough ownership by the protected area staff, lack of money, problems with the planning methodology, the community participation, lack of political will in the politicians, lack of empowerment of the protected area director, mental barriers, that covers a lot of stuff. Plans that never get approved, interests by the donors, lack of priorities within the protected areas and within the protected area system. So I don't know if any of the barriers you just thought of might fall into one or more of these categories. It's not exhaustive, but it is pretty exhausting, this list. And what we discovered when we were working is that essentially they did not implement any of these management plans. They didn't even use them as reference for their annual operating plans. So my feeling at the end of this study was a little bit intimidating and depressing. There's so many barriers out there that people were reporting. And yeah, I understand plus and dice a little bit, but that doesn't help me solve these problems. So what kind of expert would we need? Because there's no solution to say what kind of expert could help get through this morass, this swamp of barriers, this minefield, if you will, because there seems to be so many of them. Well, later that year, the answer came to me in the form of Dr. Stephen McCool. Dr. Stephen McCool was an external evaluator of public use planning in 2000, hired by RARE, so I had already met him. He's a world-renowned expert in protected wildlands management and planning. Some of you may have seen his name on some of the 200 or so publications that he has. And I was talking to him one day saying, yeah, there's so many barriers, I don't know what we're going to do, I feel all alone. You want to go write a book? And before he could answer, I said, wait, before you answer, I'm going to bribe you. Well, I didn't actually use that word. I said, I'll do most of the writing, I'll do most of the research, you just give me citations, ideas, and make sure that I don't wander off into the wilderness and never come back. And to my great surprise, he said yes. And that was the acknowledgement, that was the motivation I needed to keep going, that I wasn't the only one interested in this problem. In fact, Steve himself says that, and these are practically his own words, he has spent 35 years studying, contributing to, and watching plans fail one after the other. So although many people in their elder days in their profession aren't about to give up their paradigm because their reputation is based on it, Steve was one of those few who actually wanted something new, a new explanation, something outside the box to account for all of the failure that he had seen. And although he worked most in the United States, he has a lot of international experience as well. And in a way, he really complimented me because, and I didn't mention, it wasn't in my bio, but I'll tell you now, while I was at RARE, I did get into 2 PhD programs. And before the professor here asked, it was Sam Hamm in Idaho and Susan Jacobson in Florida. But I decided not to go. I wanted to stay working in the field. So I've always been a wannabe academic. That's why I'm right here in front of you. And he sort of filled a little bit that wannabe academic hole in my heart, right, that I needed to continue. And for the next 10 years, we were working on our book. During part of that time, about 2 years into the process, UNESCO came back to me, and the same director of the Sustainable Tourism Program who had worked with us earlier, he liked the idea. He thought the idea of this public use planning, this deeper reasons had some merit, and it was worth pursuing some more. So he hired me as an ad hoc consultant to the World Heritage Center, and we went around the world in different sites applying public use planning. And in each of these sites came a different lesson learned that contributed not only to the book, but to our practice. And I just want to share with you a few of the places that we were and a few of the lesson learns that came up. One time while I was in 2010 walking along the shore of the Black Lake in Dormitor National Park in Montenegro, which is a World Heritage Site. Now, this is the park where Tito and his partisans hid from the Germans, the Nazis, during World War II. One of the places anyway. And we were considering the different agencies that they could not agree on whether or not they should do a plan for this park. They thought, yes, no, and eventually we didn't do it. And the lesson learned that occurred to me there is, well, if there's not agreement among the stakeholders, alignment at the beginning, then creating a plan is just going to generate non-implementation. Maybe that seems obvious, but it didn't to me at the time. Moving on to Vietnam, we worked in central Vietnam, and you may know that Vietnam is one of 4 remaining communist countries in the world. and has a long tradition of top-down centralized planning, which is typical of communist countries. And because UNESCO opened the door to these sites, Vietnam has become very touristy these days, we were able to work with 2 World Heritage Sites and a biosphere reserve in central Vietnam. And one day while I was in a planning session in My Song Sanctuary, you can see this very old kind of, not architecture, but archaeological ruins, in the sweltering heat, looking at the participants, and they were so excited to being able to be involved in actually making decisions about their own area, that it wasn't somebody at the provincial or even the national level telling them what to do. I mean, for them, this was completely novel. And a year later, UNESCO quoted the manager of the Biosphere Reserve in one of their publications, which I'll show you here. You're welcome to read the Vietnamese or the English. It says, thanks to the training on and development of visitor management plan using PUP methodology, I've gained extensive knowledge and experience. What I find most important is that the methodology excels in planning, and its approach to identifying and solving problems derives from the needs and wants of tourists and later benefits tourists themselves. Engaging different stakeholders in the planning process, the outcome may reflect the will of the majority. They've never had the will of the majority reflected before in protected areas in Vietnam. So it occurred to me how very important it is to try and devolve power into the hands of not just the central government, but other agencies as well. I mean, these are central government folks as well. He's the manager of the site. Then we have Évora in Portugal. This is where Henry the Navigator in 1200 and something decided, let's become the discoverers. And all the Portuguese discoverers went around the world. Maybe you've heard of Magellan or Vasco da Gama or dozens of others. Christopher Columbus, no, because he was rejected by the Portuguese king because his idea was stupid. But anyway, that's another story. So in Évora, we had a crack team from the municipality. They're all gung-ho. They were studying public use planning. And they were ready to go. Actually, we started maybe the first third of the process, and then there was elections. And the municipality party lost the elections, and the communists took over. And they fired the top guys here, and the project ended like that. Well, that may not sound surprising to you, but it occurred to me then, our scientific studies are usually highly technical, and they're apolitical. But we can't ignore politics in planning, because largely it's a political process, and this one really struck home here when that happened. In a more recent time, in Panama, in Chagres National Park, this is the park that feeds the Panama Canal, 40% of the water. What I realized here is from the very terms of reference of the initial contract, you can sort of predict, even though the world isn't plus, whether the plan has any chance of being implemented based on how those terms of reference are written, based on how power configurations are visualized, even before you start the planning. You already know, in this case, kind of already knew, that the plan was lost. How do I mean by that? Well, the big lesson learned here was that implementation actually starts not after the plan has been done, not while you're doing the plan. It starts in the very moment the idea to plan first pops into somebody's head. Why? Because in that first moment, that person is already starting to put pieces together, the power pieces together. That person could say, okay, maybe we should just go to the communities, see if they're interested, if they want to do this. Or the more common route is, who's got the money to do this? You know, what government agencies have to get on board here? You know, who are the power players who have to get together to do this? I like to visualize it sort of like a top of a mountain, right, where you have a die sitting on top of the mountain, and it could easily roll in any direction with just a little bit of energy, right? Now, one side goes down the way of public participation and trying to do co-creation with the local communities. And the other side is, you know, the power players, the big money, the big political, the experts. And whichever way it rolls, it's probably not going to come back. It's like called path dependence. So whichever way, and that happens in the terms of reference. Which path is it going to roll down? And it's so.
Why do those have to be mutually exclusive?
Why do they have to be?
Why are they?
Well, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, every site, of course, is different, right? So the political conditions are different in different places. So you can have greater or lesser amounts of participation, holistic thinking in one site than another. In Vietnam, you need a whole lot more of a paradigm change than, say, Canada, where Canada has a lot of work indigenous in co-management. So they wouldn't need nearly as much. So you're right, it's a bit of a, you can imagine it's not such a pointy mountain. It's got a plateau here, and then the die bounces on that, and maybe stops. But and then the last example would be Calakmul Biosphere. It's a place where we're starting right now in Mexico, in the state of Campeche. It's a mixed World Heritage Site, Mayan and big forest. And here, we're starting the situation where we have no money, and we go in and say, well, we're just interested in working with you. These are our objectives. What are your objectives? Let's figure out what we're going to do together without any money. So from the outset, it's about co-creation and co-ownership. And we're actually seeing it happen. We've now been working together for 4 months. We just signed an agreement with the municipality of Calakmul. We're getting ready to do a big sort of participatory site assessment. And so far, no one's spent, well, we've spent a little bit of money to get there, but there's no money for the project yet. And they truly are co-designing this project with us. And if they don't like it, they'll stop. If we don't like it, we'll stop. So this is our first time that we're actually able to co-design together. This is more the application of the lesson learned. But one thing we've got to see out of all these different lessons learned over time is that what we're seeing is the planning process doesn't just produce a technical plan, but empowers a community to implement it, or it needs to. In other words, how you plan determines what you implement. How you plan determines what you implement. So it's kind of a summary of a lot of these lessons learned. We also started, for the book side, that was kind of the field lessons. On the book side, we were studying and coming to realize that many different fields, way beyond heritage, way beyond environment, were concerned and dealing with this plus reality. Whether it be in medicine, or whether it be in politics, or organizational development, turf management in some way. Every different field was trying to deal somehow with this plus reality, and ideas were emerging all over the world in all different kinds of fields. And we were starting to bring some of these ideas into our book and into our practice. I'm just going to share some of them with you. One that people are oftentimes surprised with, an important field for us, was software development. Why software development? Well, imagine you all have heard of Microsoft Word as an example, right? Now, how many years ago did Word start? Like 15 years ago, let's just say? I'm not actually sure. But it started with version what? Number 0. Well, you usually don't publish version 0. You start with version 1.0, exactly. Now, why didn't Microsoft just stop at 1.0? Okay, we got a good product. Computers can't do anything anyway 15 years ago. They didn't stop there because they knew the market would change. They knew the technology was evolving. They knew that competitors would appear. They knew that it was already full of bugs and they had to get the bugs out anyway. And these guys already have new ideas. We all do this. Isn't it true? Like when you're studying, you're publishing a paper, you end it, you have to wait a year for it to publish, and you get all these new ideas, and it's too late. You can't put them in the paper. I'm having that happen to me with my book right now. Well, how would I put this last citation in? No, says the editor. Because we know it's evolving. So they call it agile software development. You have version 1, and then version 1.1 and 1.2, and you release version 2. Works perfectly for plans. We talk about adaptive management, adaptive planning. That works for plans. We just continually update plans as the dice world demands. But we don't do that. But it's a good paradigm. Another one from grassroots development, multiple forms of knowing. There's a lot of different ways to know the world. Empirical is one way, an important way, but it's not the only way, right? There's also collective knowledge, there's intuitive, there's experiential, there's spiritual. All these are different ways of knowing the world. And why is that important? Well, obviously when you're planning, the more you understand and the more of the world you can see, hopefully the better plan that you come up with. And some people, like a religious person, maybe only has the spiritual kind. And if the only kind of knowledge that you're interested in is empirical, then that spiritual people can't participate, the local farmers can't participate because they are not able to manage empirical knowledge because they have other kinds. So in grassroots development, it's a way to bring many different stakeholders in. There's the idea of integral theory, that there's an interior and exterior aspect of the world. Within each person, there's feelings and there's attitudes. And within each group, there's a culture, and how that interacts with the exterior world has a great influence on whether things develop or whether they become non-implemented. Multi-stakeholder dialogue, creating win-win, co-creation, co-ownership from conflict resolution field. There's adaptive technologies here. See, not too many of you actually have phones sitting in front of you. But in each one of those phones, you have browsers. And those browsers go to websites. And those websites are designed with HTML and other languages. And what is a website? It's a format that's interactive, inexpensive, multimedia, non-lineal, easily accessible, easy update. It is the answer to the Gutenberg Bibles in terms of technology. So we have the technology right in front of us all the time for the next generation of plans. We're just not using it. Then you've got adaptive co-management and organizational learning and high resilience organizing and systems thinking and spiritual enlightenment and, well, a whole lot more that I'm not even going to talk about, but you can see in the book. So all of this leads us to a definition of what Steve and I call holistic planning. I'm only going to give you half the definition because the other half is technical, more technical still. But basically, we define it as a facilitated continuous dialogue with heritage area constituencies designed eventually to construct a consensus about a desired evolving future. There's a lot of elements there. Let me give it to you in other words that are probably even easier to digest than that. The dice world, it changes really fast. You know, again, just read the newspapers any day. And if you're adapted for the world 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you're not going to survive in the dice world. I mean, look what happened to the dinosaurs. You know, they were adapted for stable, warm, tropical, wet environment for 200 million years, and they grew plentiful, diverse, and fat. And then what happened? The asteroid came, changed the conditions, goodbye dinosaurs. Same thing's happening with bureaucratic institutions. They were designed hundreds of years ago, like the Roman Empire, designed for times that didn't change much, which is why now we see governments that aren't able to adapt, aren't able to solve problems, organizations that don't learn very quickly, don't move very quickly because they're not designed for the dice world. But you still have many different people in the business development field. We're talking about horizontal learning and distributed learning and organizational learning and print on demand and all of these new ideas about how to compensate for the dying bureaucratic mindset. So as Steve says, decades ago, governments had both the authority to plan and also the resources to implement those plans. Today, governments still have that authority, but they don't have the resources to implement. And why not? I mean, not only don't have the resources, there are many more voices in our democratic forum demanding things of the managers, and complexity is going up and up and up. So what do they need? They need communities to contribute ideas and people and resources and political support. They don't do it because it's the right thing to do it. They have to do it because they have to do it. But the communities aren't going to do that unless they own a piece of the action, right? So they need to develop certain skills to participate into the planning process, whether it's dialogue skills or conflict management or trust building. And if the planning process itself doesn't provide opportunities for that to happen, then they're not going to participate. So anyway, the dice world demands this. It has no patience for plus plans. It exclaims how you plan determines what you implement. And it doesn't do any good if only academics understand these ideas. You know, it has to make a real world change. And this is my biggest fear, and still is today. If these ideas don't change the real world, what am I sacrificing a good salary for? Why am I making my family sacrifice as well? So the answer to that is, in 2013, stop working with UNESCO, because that was producing more plans unimplemented, and created a new organization called the PUP Global Heritage Consortium, one capable of negotiating conditions that would be better for implementation, like the example in Calakmul here. And just this year, in 2016, we've just incorporated. We had our first board meeting last month with our first chairman of the board, who's just tried to call us right now. A number of different initiatives, launching a new membership program, new webinar series, a variety of different things. And almost for the first time, I don't feel alone as much anymore in this mission to figure out and to talk about with the world holistic planning. But there are other people finally joining this message that how you plan determines what you implement. And now, I think it's finally safe to dream. So what do I dream? I dream that our organization and others, when they exist in this field, will contribute to those 3 big heritage organizations changing their paradigm, proclaiming to the world that holistic planning or something like it is the new way to manage heritage, to manage the environment, with new operating guidelines, supporting new university programs. And ultimately, allowing planners who feel that they have to do scientific plans because that's where the incentives are, that's where the prestige and where the money is, that they no longer have to just do scientific plans, but they can work with communities to develop their ability to implement those plans. And this leads to my call to action for you all, especially for the students, whatever field you're in. You, as you start out, you don't have to go into the conventional planning mindset. Don't start planning in a way that you already know is outdated. For the professionals, you don't have to take a big cosmic leap to something holistic at one time. And we're discovering it's a lot of small steps to get there. Try to do a little version 1.1, version 1.2, version 1.3. For everybody, I would invite you to join us in this mission. Join our network to try and change the world, to change the paradigm of planning and management. And to remember, how you plan determines what you implement. Thank you very much for this longer than normal seminar. I have some handouts here if you like, or one handout you can take on the way out. It's a table that shows conventional planning and holistic planning, different characteristics, and a little information on my book, which is coming out on December 1st. Well, Steve and I, after this 10 years. It's been a long in the waiting, which goes into much more detail, obviously, than this seminar about ways to implement holistic planning. Very conscious that it's a big jump for anyone who's been working in conventional world, which is all of us, for all of our careers, or new careers in some cases. So, thanks again. Yes, questions or comments? Yes, I didn't get your name when I came.
I'm a geology major.
Okay, great.
And I'm working in an area of Guantico, Mexico,
Okay.
who has been afflicted by contamination in their aquifer. So, relating this to your point of, I don't know much about heritage sites, and I don't know much about kind of what you work in, so my apologies on that.
No,
but,
you don't need to.
As far as it goes, from what I digested from your talk, you're looking to kind of go small rather than going big, like working with your community to kind of implement these plans, correct?
Well, when I use the word community, I didn't specify, I mean it in the big sense. Community is any actor who has an interest in that particular place or topic. It could be people on the other side of the world. It can be there are other government agencies. So it's all the different actors in that community, not just the local people who live there, although them too.
So, if you work both big and small, the problem I see with working big is it's hard to work at that scale and actually have full implementation across the whole area.
Mm-hmm.
But on the small scale, like you said, areas are evolving. So you get new people, you get new problems, you get people that didn't see you do all this work prior, and they may. Mainly, I'm using it from a contamination aspect.
Sure.
Kind of people pumping wells and overpumping, and if they're kind of destroying this landscape on the big scale, it may not work on the small scale. We can fix for a little bit, but eventually it may digress. So my question to you is, as in your field, as the area continues to evolve, how do you plan to keep that implementation going and keeping these kind of these implemented plans going? Would you remain a force in that area, or would you hope that the community would do it, or do you hope for?
Right. Well, a couple answers. One is problems are complex and they manifest on different scales. So you can get the best local community, the best local manager, in terms of best meaning that they bought into this whole concept. And they can do wonderful things with participatory planning. But then the government has a policy that says, okay, it's going to take a year to approve this plan. And in that year, everyone loses their motivation. They lose faith in the organization. So we have to work on multiple levels because there are dimensions of the problem at multiple levels. That's part of the answer. In terms of our exit strategy, which I think is also part of your question, the idea is that we would like an intervention of 3 years with the site. This is hypothetical. Where that first year is intensive planning and we work there, we have multiple trips. And as we go into the implementation phase, version 1.1, 1.2 of the plan, then we're advising. We may have a local staff person in all of our countries we work in, tend to have country representatives. And as time goes on, we sort of disappear into the background. And then eventually, after 3 or 4 years, hopefully, all we're doing is, they're part of our network, and we're sharing information and lessons learned from different parts of the world. So our degree of protagonism just goes down exponentially. That's the ideal. And that's not an idea that we've come up with. That's the exit strategy in development, the development world in general. Facilitate intensively at the beginning, and as they get the skills and they get the vision and more resources are brought on locally, then you just move farther and farther away. We're not the kind of organization that wants to put our name on the cover of a plan, for example. A lot of consulting companies do that. Put their name, they want the credit, but that's just a way of saying we're not leaving, this is our project, not yours. So yes, fading away is the best. But not completely away, because we want to have a global network of all the places where we've worked. To the degree possible.
Try to fix the whole picture in my mind. So basically, we can say that we are dividing planning in 3 steps. So the beginning, then when we work hard and take the data and we actually pull the plan. The second step would be trying to implement the plan, and a third step will be stay there seeking for leaders that continues with that plan until you as organization are able to.
Until we disappear. No, I would say there's 4 general phases. They're very messy and overlap a lot. The first phase is the negotiation, where you're negotiating with the different actors in the site what it is you want to do, so that those terms of reference actually support implementation and don't go against it. Like in Calakmul, we're in the negotiation phase right now. I haven't done anything on the ground. I've made one visit. And we're talking about what is we want to do. Co-create the idea. Then, once we have the idea, go into this, if we're going to do planning at all, that more intensive planning phase. And then, after that, you have more of the accompaniment phase. We'll walk with you, not in front of you, not pushing you from behind. And if you don't need our hand, we'll take our hand away. And the 4th phase, which we haven't got to yet in real life, would be they become part of our consortium, part of our network, part of the champions for the new paradigm. And that could last until the paradigm changes. But that's just hypothetical. We don't have that yet. No, not a question. Any other question or comment?
Are you familiar with John Randolph's work in environmental planning?
Tell me what he does and I'll tell you if I've heard him.
Former, I think he's retired now. So environmental land use planning is a book that he wrote.
Nope, I haven't seen that one.
So he talks a lot about collaborative planning.
A lot of people do talk about
The
collaborative.
Nature Conservancy, of course, is, I think, been focused on collaborative kinds of efforts to do planning in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah,
I don't know what's your view of it.
Well, it's an evolving organization. I mean, it's so big that it's got very conventional elements. It's driven largely by scientists, but they've made a lot of inroads. They have a lot more social scientists now, and there's more participation. I mean, there's a lot of different facets to an organization that big. So there's some that I would say are leading edge, and others that are, I'm just going to study my animals and that's it. Keep away from the territory. It's such a huge organization. But collaborative, there's a lot of authors who work on collaborative planning, which is only part of it. Collaboration isn't enough if you still only see the world in plus terms. Plus collaboration go together, but they still produce plans that don't get implemented. And then there's what is collaboration. There's different levels of collaboration. There's the most typical one where, we have a workshop, I invite everyone to come, you give me your opinions, I'm the consultant, I'll write them down, and then I'll decide later which of those ideas I'm going to use and which I'm going to discard, which is a very low level of collaboration. Then there's a very high level where the government doesn't have the power. The citizenry might have the power. So Judith Ines has a very important book on collaborative planning. And she's not nature, she's just planning in general, I believe. Jesse.
What variable would you say is the largest factor in stakeholder involvement in plan development?
Well, they need to see, I'm not sure it's one, it's probably a suite of variables. They need to feel that they're co-owning the idea, it's not being imposed, that they have true voice and true vote in coming up with the idea, and that it truly meets their felt needs. The problem with UNESCO oftentimes when I was there, despite the best intentions, the decisions were made in Paris. Who the donors, what were the sites, and we would kind of ride in like white knights on our white horses, right? With a shield with the UNESCO symbol on it and a sack of gold in the other hand. And despite our best intentions, then we'd walk up to a site like in Vietnam and say, would you like to participate in our project? And they look up the power, the prestige, the money. No one's going to say no, right? But when that money ran out and the white knight turns around and goes back to Paris, then nothing happens. There's no implementation because it wasn't their objectives. It wasn't their idea. Obviously there's no monolithic they either. There's a whole process of getting to a point where everyone agrees on having a plan, but they don't all have the same vision of what they want out of it. So I don't mean to oversimplify, even though I'm doing that a little bit. So I don't know what the variable is. That would be the most, but. Co-ownership, co-creation. Co-creation leads to co-ownership. And that doesn't apply everywhere either.
I think we are running
Right.
out of time.
Yes, definitely.
Let's thank John again.
Thank you.
Next week we have a special seminar again.